Good morning, friends. Happy 4th of July. In that same year, the practice of arresting students began. For example, the group of Yevgenia Doyarenko in the Timiryazev Academy for criticism of the system, not in public, merely in conversation among themselves. Such cases, however, were evidently few because the group in question was interrogated by Meshinsky and Yagoda personally. Also in 1921, the arrest of members of all non-Bolshevik parties were expanded and systemized. In fact, all Russia's political parties had been buried except the victorious one. Oh, do not dig a grave for someone else. And so that the dissolution of these parties would be irreversible, it was necessary that their members should disintegrate, and their physical bodies too. Not one citizen of the former Russian state who had ever joined a party other than the Bolshevik party could avoid his fate. He was condemned unless, like Maisky and Vyshinsky, he succeeded in making his way across the planks of the wreck of the Bolsheviks. He might not be arrested in the first group, he might live on, depending on how dangerous he was believed to be until 1922, 32, or even 37, but the lists were kept. His turn would and did come. He was arrested or else politely invited to an interrogation, where he was asked just one question: had he been a member of such and such from then till then. There were also questions about hostile activity, but the first question decided everything, as is clear to us now, decades later. From there on, his fate might vary. Some were put immediately in one of the famous Tsarist central prisons. Fortunately, all the Tsarist central prisons had been well preserved, and some socialists even ended up in the very same cells and with the very same jailers they had had before. Others were offered the opportunity of going into exile. Oh, not for long, just for 2 or 3 years, and some had it even easier, and were merely given a minus. A certain number of cities were forbidden, and told to pick out a new place of residence themselves, and for the future would they please be so kind as to stay fixed in that one place and await the pleasure of the GPU. This whole operation was stretched out over many years because it was of primary importance that it be stealthy and unnoticed. It was essential to clean out, conscientiously, socialists of every other stripe from Moscow, Petrograd, the ports, the industrial centers, and later on the outlying provinces as well. This was a grandiose, silent game of solitaire. Those rules were totally incomprehensible to its contemporaries, in whose outlines we can appreciate only now. Someone's far-seeing mind, someone's neat hands planned it all, without letting one wasted minute go by. They picked up a card which had spent 3 years in one pile and softly placed it in another pile. And the person who had been imprisoned in a central prison was thereby shifted into exile, and a good way off. Someone who had served out a minus sentence was sent into exile too, but out of sight of the rest of the minus category, or else from exile to exile and then back again to the central prison, but this time a different one. Patience, overwhelming patience, was the trait of the person playing out the solitaire. And without any noise, without an outcry, the members of all the other parties slipped gradually out of sight, lost all connection with the places and people where they were, and their revolutionary activities were known, and thus, imperceptibly and mercilessly, was prepared the annihilation of those who had once raged against tyranny at student meetings and had clanked their czarist shackles in pride. In this game of big solitaire, the majority of the old political prisoners, survivors of hard labor, were destroyed, for it was primarily the SRs and the anarchists, not the social democrats, who had received the harshest sentences from the Tsarist courts. They in particular had made up the population of the Tsarist hard labor political prisons. There was justice in the priorities of destruction, however. In 1920, they were all offered the chance to renounce in writing their parties and party ideologies. Some declined, and they naturally came up first for annihilation. Others signed such renunciations and thereby added a few years to their lifetimes. But their turn, too, came implacably, and their heads rolled implacably from their shoulders. In the spring of 1922, the Extraordinary Commission for Struggle Against Counter-Revolution, Sabotage, and Speculation, the Cheka, recently renamed the GPU, decided to intervene in church affairs. It was called on to carry out a church revolution, to remove the existing leadership and replace it with one which would have only one ear turned to heaven and the other to the Lubyanka. The so-called living church people seemed to go along with this plan, but without outside help they could not gain control of the church apparatus. For this reason, the Patriarch Tikhon was arrested, and 2 resounding trials were held, followed by the execution in Moscow of those who had publicized the Patriarch's appeal, and in Petrograd of the Metropolitan Vinamin, who had attempted to hinder the transfer of ecclesiastical power to the Living Church group. Here and there in the provincial centers, and even further down in the administrative districts, metropolitans and bishops were arrested. And as always, in the wake of the big fish followed shoals of smaller fry, archpriest, monk, and deacons. These arrests were not even reported in the press. They also arrested those who refused to swear to support the Living Church renewal movement. Men of religion were an inevitable part of every annual catch, and their silver locks gleamed in every cell and in every prisoner transport en route to the Solovetsky Islands. From the early 20s on, arrests were also made among the groups of theosophists, mystics, spiritualists. Count Palin's group used to keep official transcripts of its communication with the spirit world. Also, religious societies and philosophers of the Berdyaev circle. The so-called Eastern Catholics, followers of Vladimir Solyev, were arrested and destroyed in passing, as was the group of A.I. Abrakosova, and of course ordinary Roman Catholics, Polish Catholic priests, etc., were arrested too as part of the normal course of events. However, the root destruction of religion in the country, which throughout the 20s and 30s was one of the most important goals of the GPU NKVD, could be realized only by mass arrests of Orthodox believers, monks and nuns whose black habits had been a distinctive feature of old Russian life, were intensively rounded up on every hand, placed under arrest and sent into exile. The arrested and sentenced active laymen. The circles kept getting bigger, as they raked in ordinary believers as well, old people, and particularly women, who were the most stubborn believers of all, and who, for many years to come, would be called nuns in transit prisons and in camps. True, they were supposedly being arrested and tried not for their actual faith, but for openly declaring their convictions and for bringing up their children in the same spirit. As Tanya Kodkevich wrote, "You can pray freely, but just so God alone can hear." She received a 10-year sentence for these verses. A person convinced that he possessed spiritual truth was required to conceal it from his own children. In the 20s, the religious education of children was classified as a political crime under Article 5810 of the Code, in other words, counter-revolutionary propaganda. True, one was still permitted to renounce one's religion at one's trial. It didn't often happen, but it nonetheless did happen that the father would renounce his religion and remain at home to raise the children, while the mother went on to the Solovetsky Islands. Throughout all those years, women manifested great firmness in their faith. All persons convicted of religious activity received tenors, the longest term then given. In those years, particularly in 1927, in purging the big cities of the pure society that was coming into being, they sent prostitutes to the Solovetsky Islands along with the nuns. Those lovers of a sinful, earthly life were given 3-year sentences under a more lenient article of the Code. The conditions in prisoner transports, in transit prisons, and on the Solovetsky Islands were not of a sort to hinder them from playing their merry trade among the administrators and the convoy guards, and 3 years later they would return with laden suitcases to the places they had come from. Religious prisoners, however, were prohibited from ever returning to their children and their home areas. As early as the early 20s, waves appeared that were purely national in character. At first not very large in proportion to the populations of their homeland, especially by Russian yardsticks. Masavadists from Azerbaijan, Dashniks from Armenia, Georgian Mensheviks, and Turkmenian Basmakai were resisting the establishment of Soviet power in Central Asia. The first Central Asian Soviets were Russian in makeup by an overwhelming majority, and were therefore seen as outposts of Russian power. In 1926, the Zionist Society of Hahalutz was exiled in Toto, since it had failed to respond to the all-powerful upsurge of internationalism. Among subsequent generations, a picture has evolved of the 20s as some kind of holiday of total, unlimited freedom. In this book, we shall encounter people who viewed the 20s quite differently. The non-party students at this time sought autonomy for higher educational institutions, the right of assembly, the removal of the curriculum of excessive political indoctrination. Arrests were the answer. These were intensified during holidays. For example, on May 1st, 1924, in 1925, about 100 Leningrad students were sentenced to 3 years in political detention for reading the Sotsialistический Vestnik, the organ of the Mensheviks abroad, and for studying Plekhanov. In his youth, Plekhanov himself had gotten off far more lightly for speaking out against the government in front of the Kazan Cathedral. In 1925, they had already begun to arrest the first young Trotskyites. 2 naive Red Army men, remembering the Russian tradition, began to collect funds for the arrested Trotskyites, and they too were put in political detention. And of course, it is obvious that the exploiting classes were not spared. Throughout the 1920s, the hunt continued for former officers who had managed to survive. Whites, those who had not already earned execution during the Civil War. White Reds, who had fought on both sides, and Tsarist Reds. Tsarist officers who had gone over to the Red Army and had not served in it for the whole period, or who had gaps in their army service records and no documents to account for them. They were truly put through the mill because, instead of being sentenced immediately, they too were put through the solitaire game. Endless verifications, limitations on the kind of work they could do, and where they could live. They were taken into custody, released, taken into custody again, and only gradually did they proceed to the camps from which they did not return. However, sending these officers to the archipelago did not end the problem, but only set it in motion. After all, their mothers, wives, and children were still at liberty. With the help of unerring social analysis, it was easy to see what kind of mood they were in after the heads of their households had been arrested, and thus they simply compelled their own arrest too, and one more wave was set rolling. In the 1920s, there was an amnesty for Cossacks who had taken part in the Civil War. Many of them returned from the island of Lemnos to the Kuban, where they were given land. All of them were subsequently arrested. And of course, all former state officials had gone into hiding and were likewise liable to be hunted down. They had hidden well and disguised themselves cleverly, making use of the fact that there was as yet no internal passport system, nor any unified system of workbooks in the Republic, and they managed to creep into Soviet institutions. In such cases, slips of the tongue, chance recognitions, and the denunciation of neighbors helped battle intelligence, so to speak. Sometimes sheer accident took a hand. Solely out of a love of order, a certain Mova kept at home a list of all former employees of the provincial judiciary. This was discovered by accident in 1925, and they were all arrested and shot. And so the waves rolled on for concealment of social origin and for former social origin. This received the wildest interpretation. They arrested members of the nobility for their social origin. They arrested members of their families. Finally, unable to draw even simple distinctions, they arrested members of the individual nobility, i.e., anybody who had simply graduated from the university. And once they had been arrested, there was no way back. You can't undo what has been done. The sentinel of the revolution never makes a mistake. No, there were a few ways back. The counter-waves were thin, sparse, but they did sometimes break through. The first is worthy of mention right here. Among the wives and daughters of the nobility and the officers, there were quite often women of outstanding personal qualities and attractive appearance. Some succeeded in breaking through in a small reverse wave. They were the ones who remembered that life is given to us only once, and that nothing is more precious to us than our own life. They offered their services to the Cheka GPU as informers, as colleagues, in any capacity whatsoever, and those who were liked were accepted. Those who were the most fertile were all informers. They helped the GPU a great deal because former people trusted them. Here one can name the last Princess Vyazemskaya, the most prominent post-revolutionary informer, as was her son, on the Solovetsky Islands. And Concordia Nikolayevna Iosi was evidently a woman of brilliant qualities. Her husband was an officer who had been shot in her presence, and she herself was exiled to the Solovetsky Islands, but she managed to beg her way out and to set up a salon near the big Lubyanka, which the important figures of that establishment loved to frequent. She was not arrested again until 1937, along with her Yagoda customers. It is strange to recount, but as a result of an absurd tradition, the political Red Cross had been preserved from old Russia. There were 3 branches: the Moscow branch, Peshkova Vinaver, the Kharkov, Sandomierskaya, and the Petrograd. The one in Moscow behaved itself and was not dissolved until 1937. The one in Petrograd, the old Narodnik Shevtsov, the cripple Gartman, and Kocharovsky, adopted an intolerably impudent stance, mixed in political cases, tried to get support from such former inmates of the Schusselburg prison as Novorovsky, who had been convicted of the same case as Lenin's brother, Alexander Ulanov, and helped not only socialists but also KR's counter-revolutionaries. In 1926 it was shut down and its leaders were sent into exile. The years go by and everything that has not been freshly recalled to us is wiped from our memory. In the dim distance we see the year 1927 as a careless, well-fed year of the still untruncated NEP. But in fact it was tense. It shuddered as newspaper headlines exploded, and it was considered at the time, and portrayed to us then, as the threshold of a war for world revolution. The assassination of the Soviet ambassador in Warsaw, which filled whole columns of the papers that June, aroused Mayakovsky to dedicate 4 thunderous verses to the subject. But here's bad luck for you. Poland offered an apology. Vyakov's lone assassin was arrested there, and so how and against whom was the poet's appeal to be directed? With cohesion, construction, grit, and repression, wring the neck of this gang, run riot. Who was to be repressed? Whose neck should be wrung? It was then that the so-called Voykav draft began. As always happened when there were incidents of disturbance or tension, they arrested former people, anarchists, SRs, Mensheviks, and also the intelligentsia, as such. Indeed, who else was there to arrest in the cities? Not the working class. But the old, close to the cadets intelligentsia had already been thoroughly shaken up, starting in 1919. Had the time not come to shake up that part of the intelligentsia which imagined itself to be progressive, to give the students a once-over? Once again, Mayakovsky came to the rescue. Think about the Komsomol for days and for weeks. Look over your ranks, watch them with care. Are all of them really Komsomols? Or are they only pretending to be? A convenient world outlook gives rise to the convenient juridical term social prophylaxis. It was introduced and accepted, and it was immediately understood by all. Lazar Kogan, one of the bosses of the White Sea Canal construction, would, in fact, soon say, "I believe that you personally were not guilty of anything. But as an educated person you have to understand that social prophylaxis is being widely applied. And when else, in fact, should unreliable fellow travelers, all that shaky intellectual rot, be arrested, if not in the eve of the war for world revolution? When the big war actually began, it would be too late. And so in Moscow they began a systematic search, block by block. Someone had to be arrested everywhere. The slogan was, "We are going to bang our fist on the table so hard that the world will shake with terror." So it was to the Lubyanka, to the Butriki, that the black Marias, the passenger cars, the enclosed trucks, the open hansom cabs kept moving even by day. There was a jam at the gates, a jam in the courtyard. They didn't have time to unload and register those they'd arrested. And the same situation existed in other cities. In Rostov-on-the-Don, during those days, the floor was so crowded in the cellar of House 33 that the newly arrived Boyko could hardly find a place to sit down. A typical example from this wave, several dozen young people got together for some kind of musical evening, which had not been authorized ahead of time by the GPU. They listened to music and then drank tea. They got the money for the tea by voluntarily contributing their own kopecks. It was quite clear, of course, that this music was a cover for counter-revolutionary sentiments, and that the money was being collected not for tea, but to assist the dying world bourgeoisie. And they were all arrested and given from 3 to 10 years. Anna Skripkenkova getting 5, while Ivan Nikolayevich Vorontsov and the other organizers of the affair who refused to confess were shot. And in that same year, somewhere in Paris, a group of Russian immigré lycée graduates gathered to celebrate the traditional Pushkin holiday. A report of this was published in the papers. It was clearly an intrigue on the part of mortally wounded imperialism, and as a result, all lycée graduates still left in the USSR were arrested, and so were the so-called law students, graduates of another such privileged special school of pre-revolutionary Russia. only the size of SLON, the Solovetsky Special Purpose Camp, limited for the time being the scale of the Voykev draft. But the Gulag Archipelago had already begun its malignant life and would shortly metastasize throughout the whole body of the nation. A new taste had been acquired and a new appetite began to grow. The time had long since arrived to crush the technical intelligentsia, which had come to regard itself as too irreplaceable and had not gotten used to catching instructions on the wing. In other words, we never did trust the engineers, and from the very first years of the revolution we saw to it that those lackeys and servants of former capitalist bosses were kept in line by healthy suspicion and surveillance by the workers. However, during the Reconstruction period we did permit them to work in our industries, while the whole force of the class assault was directed against the rest of the intelligentsia. But the more our own economic leadership matured in VSNKH, the Supreme Council of the Economy, and Gosplan, the State Planning Commission, the more the number of plans increased, and the more those plans overlapped and conflicted with one another, the clearer became the old engineers' basic commitment to wrecking their insincerity, slyness, venality. The sentinel of the revolution narrowed its eyes with even greater vigilance, and wherefore it directed its narrow gaze, it immediately discovered a nest of wreckers. Have a good day, friends.